What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today I want to talk to you about one of my top spring bass fishing secrets that I've never heard any pros ever talk about on television shows and magazines or even on the Bassmaster Elite Series and FLW TV shows. And this is a spring fishing secret that I learned by fishing with professional anglers and local sticks in my area. And it's a way that you can adapt during the spring to stay with the big female bass even as they transition between their pre-spawn and their spawning patterns. And it's a technique that if you can figure it out and apply it on your own lake, you're gonna be consistently catching fish all spring long. So let's get into it. Okay, so to explain what I'm talking about, I'm going to use a tournament that I fished on Lake DeGray in Arkansas in the spring. And this tournament was held at the end of March, and I was only able to practice the weekend before the event on a Saturday. And on that Saturday, the weather conditions were overcast, we had some wind and some clouds, and water temperatures were between 54 and 56 degrees on the upper end of Lake DeGray where I practiced. And during my practice, I was crushing them on crankbaits, Carolina rigs, and lipless crankbaits on secondary points and places where the bass were staging before they moved up to spawn. And I ended up catching 2 or 3 3-pounders in practice and shook off a bunch of other fish and left a lot of fish alone because I didn't want to beat them up and completely wear out my fish. But I was still really confident going into the tournament that I had a lot of fish saved and I had a really good idea of what the fish were doing. But then the week between my practice day and my tournament day, we had a warming trend, and we had 3 or 4 days in a row where we had bright sunny skies and air temperatures were between 70 and 80 degrees. This caused water temperatures to rise all over the lake. And the morning of the tournament, I noticed that the water temperatures in my starting area were 4 to 6 degrees warmer than they were the weekend before. Instead of facing 54 to 56 degree water, I was facing 60 to 62 degree water in the areas I was fishing. And this pushed a lot of fish up to the bank and put them in what I call the spawning funk. And I'll let y'all do with that what you will in the comments, but basically it's the period when the bass first start to mate and lay their eggs. And during this period, the bass are not interested in feeding, and they're not protecting any eggs on their beds because they haven't laid any yet. So they have no incentive to feed, and it's really hard to get those fish to bite. And this always happens in the first week or two when those water temperatures hit 60 degrees, and a lot of bass will be focused exclusively on spawning, and they won't touch any of your lures. So faced with these spawning funk conditions, I did terrible, and I managed to catch 1 small male bass on a bed on a wacky worm, but my Carolina rig and crankbait bite completely disappeared, and there were no fish left on the staging areas where I found them in practice. And it wasn't because I beat the fish up in practice by catching too many, it's just that they had moved out of their pre-spawn pattern into that spawning funk in a week because of all of that warm weather. And I had noticed that a lot of the guys around me weren't catching fish either. And I talked to several of them, and the best guy had like 3 fish for 5 pounds in that area. And they all were talking about how we had been crushing them the weekend before when we had the colder water temperatures and those overcast skies. So at the end of the day, I took my 1 small fish back to weigh in, and one of my buddies weighed in 18 pounds and won the tournament. And I asked him, man, how'd you catch those fish? And he said, oh, it's just throwing a jerkbait and a Carolina rig down by the dam, catching pre-spawn bass. And needless to say, I was pretty shocked to hear this because that's how I caught all my fish in practice, and I'd spent half of my tournament day trying to get that bite to work. And I spent most of my tournament and practice on the upper end of Lake DeGray in the dirtier water. And so I asked my friend what the water temperatures were and the water clarity on the lower end of the lake where he caught his fish. And he said that the water temperatures were between 56 and 57 degrees, and the water had 3 to 5 feet of visibility where he was catching those pre-spawn bass. And right away, I realized that those fish were still in their pre-spawn patterns because the water temperatures on the lower end of the lake were 3 to 5 degrees cooler than on the upper end of the lake where I was fishing. And up to that point, I'd never thought that water temperatures could vary so much from the lower end to the upper end of a lake, especially a lake the size of Lake DeGray. It's not a huge lake, and I always thought that the fish were going to be pretty much in the same stage all over the lake. And if I was catching fish in the pre-spawn on the upper end, they'd be in the pre-spawn on the lower end, and I was just making my choice on area of the lake based on the water clarity I wanted to fish. But what I've come to learn over the years is that water temperatures will fluctuate a lot depending on the water clarity in the area of the lake you're fishing. And in general, dirty water, water that has less than 2 foot of visibility, is going to warm up a lot faster than clear water, which has maybe 2 foot or more visibility. And at the same time, the clear water will warm up a lot slower than the dirty water. And so in the spring, this is really important because when you have a warming trend like I did the week before my tournament, those warm days are going to warm up the dirtier water a lot faster than the clear water. And this is what caused water temperatures on the upper end of Lake DeGray to be between 60 and 62 degrees, and the water temperatures on the lower end of the lake to be between 56 and 58 degrees. And this 2 to 5 degree difference in water temperature was enough to put the fish on the upper end of Lake DeGray in that spawning funk, where they weren't wanting to bite at all, and it kept the fish on the lower end of the lake in their pre-spawn patterns for a few extra days so that my friend could actually get some aggressive fish to bite and catch 18 pounds and completely kick my butt. So that's the secret. It's that bass will spawn at different times on different parts of a lake, especially if the lake is big enough. And this can be super important in the springtime because you can go to one area of your lake and find that the bass are in that spawning funk and they've transitioned out of that pre-spawn mode and they're not willing to bite. But if you're able to identify this, you can actually change the area of the lake you're fishing in. So let's say you're fishing on the top end of the lake in the dirty water and those fish are in that spawning funk. Well, halfway through the day you can make an adjustment and run down to the bottom end of the lake where the clear water is and find some pre-spawn bass. And vice versa, if you're seeing a lot of bass in the spawning funk on the lower end of the lake in the clear water, you can actually run up to the top end of the lake and find bass locked on the beds, protecting their fry or their eggs because they've already spawned because the water's a little bit warmer on the upper end and they're further along in their spawning process. And I'm not saying that this is going to cause a huge gap between when the bass on the upper end of the lake and the lower end of the lake spawn. It's not like the bass on the upper end are going to spawn at the beginning of April and the bass on the lower end are going to spawn at the beginning of May. It's normally going to be a 3 to 10 day difference in when those bass start to spawn in general. Moreover, the secret doesn't just apply to lakes where you have a clear distinction between that clear water and the dirty water. If you take Lake Seminole, for example, where the FLW Tour just fished a tournament last weekend, some of the top pros were catching pre-spawn bass on the main lake. And the main lake is wide open, it's muddy, and there's a lot of wind and current that gets pushed around, which keeps that water temperatures down. And then some of the other pros were catching spawning bass back in shallow backwater ponds where there was actually clear water, but there was also emergent vegetation that was getting warmed up by the sun, and those bass were actually spawning back in these old ponds while the fish on the main lake were in the pre-spawn mode. And so in this case, the bass in the clear water spawned first and the bass in the dirty water spawned later. But that's because you had those shallow backwater ponds that would warm up a little bit faster, and you had the main lake that had all that wind on it. And so these rules aren't hard and fast by any means, and you may find that water temperatures vary on your lake as well in situations I haven't described here. But in general, what you need to pay attention for is differences in water temperature around your lake, and that's what's going to cause those bass to spawn at different times. And if you can find areas with different water temperatures in practice for a tournament, you can sometimes adapt mid-tournament and try to leave areas where the bass are in that spawning funk or in that spawning mode and try to find bass that are in a more active pre-spawn mode or even a post-spawn mode, depending on the time of year you're fishing. Okay, so I know I just threw a bunch of information at you really quick there at the end, but this is definitely a spring bass fishing secret that a lot of people do not talk about. And it's one that's very situational and it may only apply a couple weeks out of the year. But it's one of those secrets that I like to share on my channel because it's something that took me a long time to learn through trial and error, fishing a lot of different situations and fishing tournaments for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so hopefully this will help you guys if you find yourself in a similar situation this spring. And so feel free to leave a comment down below if you have any questions about what I was talking about and need more clarity. And also let me know if you face similar conditions on your lake and if the lake sets up the same way as my lakes did that I use in my examples, or if there are other types of lakes where the same type of principle will apply. So either way, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about some cool bass fishing secrets with me. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button down below. It really helps out the videos and helps them get spread out to more people. And also share the video out with friends and on social media. Again, it really helps the channel grow. And obviously subscribe for more content if you haven't already. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you next time.